In the last two lectures, we looked at the beginning of opposition to Jesus by the scribes and the Pharisees, and that began with Jesus' healing the paralyzed man in Mark 2, verses 1 through 12. The second event, which indicated opposition, was the calling of the tax collector Levi. In this lecture, we're going to look at the final three events that led to increasing opposition to Jesus, and ultimately, with the final event, caused the Pharisees and the Herodians, who previously had been opposed to each other, to conspire together to destroy Jesus. And these final three events are the fact that Jesus' disciples did not fast. Then the next event is on one Sabbath. Jesus' disciples were picking grain in a field and rubbing it and then eating it. And the final one at the beginning of chapter 3 is Jesus healed a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath in a synagogue. And so one of the things that we have seen in the previous two lectures is that these events, the healings and the calling and eating with Levi, are revealing who Jesus is and the nature of the gospel. And that theme will continue here in these final three episodes that lead the Pharisees and Herodians to conspire to kill Jesus. So the first event is chapter 2, verses 18 through 22, which says this: Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, came to Jesus, Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed. And so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. Now, in this particular event, it's the one event in which Jesus is not specifically being attacked. Mark's account says that people came to him and asked why John's disciples and the Pharisees fast, but Jesus' disciples don't. But implicit in their question lies the criticism that was being made of Jesus by the Pharisees, namely that Jesus is breaking tradition. Thus, both the question and Jesus' answer take us back to the issue raised in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, namely who Jesus is, and also the question raised with the calling of Levi, what Jesus does. Now, very briefly, fasting in the Old Testament, fasting was only required initially on the Day of Atonement. After the exile in Babylon, 4 additional annual fasts were observed. Now, fasts were sometimes called by leaders and prophets in response to particular events, such as times of great national danger, or when repentance and humility were needed. And fasts were often privately observed for various reasons. Now, Jesus responds to the question here by talking about himself as the bridegroom. Remember, Jesus did fast for 40 days while he was in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. He did not repudiate fasting, but he never gave his disciples or us any instruction or advice about fasting on a regular basis. You may know that when Jesus told the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee in the temple, the Pharisee said, I fast twice a week. And that's indicated in the question to Jesus here, that the Pharisees fasted on a regular basis. Now, the reason why Jesus' disciples did not fast is because he said, I'm the bridegroom. And actually, at that time, weddings were times of great joy. They were often, in fact, fasting was forbidden during a wedding celebration. Sometimes those celebrations could last for a week or two. And to fast when the bridegroom was there would have been considered ridiculous and insulting. And so Jesus is saying, I am the bridegroom. How can you fast when I am here? And so it's important to note that when Jesus comes to bring great joy, and again, we saw this when he is feasting with Levi and the other sinners as sort of a forerunner of the great messianic banquet that all of Jesus's people will experience forever in eternity. Now, God had compared himself to a bridegroom in Isaiah 62, verse 5. Now, Jesus is saying, I am that bridegroom. By calling himself the bridegroom, Jesus was in effect saying that he was the fulfillment of everything the Old Testament had pointed to. And it's another way of saying, back in when he healed the paralyzed man, he called himself the Son of Man. And again, that he was identifying himself with God. Now, by calling himself the bridegroom, he is again identifying himself with God. And so fasting was also, and I guess one of the things I just want to emphasize here is, again, the subtlety and the depth of what's going on in Mark. We talked about the significance of the Son of Man, now the subtlety of calling himself the bridegroom. But as N.T. Wright indicates, there was a great theological depth to Jesus' answer. Because Wright says, fasting in this period of time was not for Jews simply a spiritual discipline or part of the general practice of piety. It had to do with Israel's present condition. She was still, in effect, in exile. And more specifically, it had to do with commemorating the destruction of the temple. Zechariah had promised that feasts would be turned into fasts, that fasts would be turned into feasts. That could only come about when God himself restored the fortunes of his people. And that is precisely what Jesus is saying. By calling himself the bridegroom, by not having his disciples fast, he is saying, that has begun now in me, in the gospel. So this is not just a teaching on religion or morality. It is a claim about eschatology. Again, Jesus is saying, by calling himself the bridegroom, and by not having his disciples fast, it's another way of saying what he said back in chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. The time is at hand. The kingdom is here. It is here in me. So you shouldn't be down in the mouth and so on and so forth. The king has come and is making everything new. This is symbolic, but these are the kind of things that are behind what otherwise might be a sort of cryptic statement from Jesus. Now, in verse 20, Jesus cautioned, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away, and then they will fast in that day. That's probably a veiled reference to his crucifixion, and then to his ascension back to the Father. Now, assuming that to be true, there are a few things we need to bear in mind. First, our situation is not identical to the situation of Jesus' disciples because Jesus was physically present with them. And so verse 20 suggests that fasting by Christians is acceptable today. And in fact, both Acts 13, verses 1 through 3, and the early church manual called the Didache indicate that the early church did practice fasting. Secondly, fasting can be a spiritual discipline for consecrating oneself to God, for seeking His will, and a closer relationship with Him, and for other similar reasons. And fasting may also have important health benefits. And we just need to caution ourselves, if you fast on a regular basis, don't turn it into a law. And that's so easy. I remember many years ago, I used to fast every Wednesday. And it started out fine, but the more I did it, I was thinking, oh, it's Wednesday. I have to fast. I wanted to. Well, then I have to. So I'd start eating a lot on Tuesday. I turned it into a law. We need to be careful in turning a spiritual discipline into some kind of legalism. Thirdly, we need to remember, while Jesus is not bodily present with us anymore, He is present in the person of the Holy Spirit. And in fact, the Holy Spirit is not only with us, but is in us. And consequently, our life as Christians should not be characterized by sorrow or gloom, but by joy and peace. The Spirit leads us, guides us, empowers us, and communicates with us. So let us draw on Him and be in close communion with Him. And if fasting helps us to draw closer to Him, then well and good. Now, he talked about the patch on an old garment and new wine in old wineskins. Those illustrations indicate this. Putting a patch on an old garment and new wine into old wineskins would have been familiar to his audience. It may not be to us. Verse 21 about the patch on the garment essentially means this. If one tries to mend a shrunken piece of cloth with a new patch, the patch will eventually shrink and tear away from the shrunken cloth, because the shrunken cloth will have no give left in it. And regarding verse 22 and the wine and wineskins, in Jesus' day, people used animal skins, like goat skin, for storing liquids. Fermented drinks, like wine, expanded, and since an old wineskin would already have stretched to its limit, the new wine would, as it expanded, tear the seams as the wine expanded. And so, since the old wineskin already would have been stretched to the limit, it would have torn. And the wine would have been ruined, and the wineskin would have been ruined, which is why you put new wine into new wineskins, so that they will be able to stretch along with the fermenting wine. And so, what Jesus was saying, and by healing the paralyzed man through his word alone, and by eating with Levi and the tax collectors and sinners, what he was doing in these statements about the garment and the patch and the wine and the wineskins, he's demonstrating that God is not confined behind our traditions, but reaches out to reach sinners in surprising ways. You see, Jesus was confronting all who knew him with fundamental choices as to what our relationship with God is all about and what God himself is like. We need to realize and recognize the bursting, ripping power of the gospel is continual in its application. And anywhere the old human tradition and our old nature dominates, the gospel is here to bring dynamic life and new life. And that's something, again, that we as Christians need to be aware of, because all of our churches have developed various traditions, and we all tend to baptize them, just like the Pharisees baptized their traditions. And by doing that, and traditions may be very good things, but by doing that, we may miss the move of the Spirit who wants to bring us life. Now, the next event is found in verses 23 through 28, which say this. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, pardon me, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, according to Deuteronomy 23, it was legal to pluck heads of grain from a neighbor's field. However, the oral law, which developed over time, forbade doing this on the Sabbath. And Jesus' first answer to the Pharisees referred to what David did as recorded in 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 6, for which David is not condemned in the Old Testament. Jesus appeared to be, by referring to David and what David did, appeared to be making a threefold argument. First, since David was not condemned, why are you condemning me? Second, the issue for David was not merely picking and husking grain, but the much more serious charge of eating the bread of the presence, which only the priests were allowed to eat. And consequently, there was no basis to condemn Jesus or his disciples, since they were not eating even the bread of the presence. And third, he's making the argument that human need takes precedence over the ceremonial aspects of the law. And but in verse 27 and 28, when he says, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, that goes to the heart and the fundamental issue of the nature of the Sabbath and of Jesus's relation to the Sabbath. When he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, essentially he's saying that you Pharisees, with all of your restrictions and regulations, which were designed to kind of put a fence around the law, so that if you didn't go over that fence, you could never violate the Sabbath or the law. He says, with all of those restrictions, you've ended up making the Sabbath an intolerable burden. You've forgotten that the Sabbath, in its origin, was God's merciful provision for his creatures so that they could have a day of rest. Now, verse 28 about the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath presses this point home to the ultimate degree. Because what he's saying here is that the real issue is not the Sabbath, but the issue is his identity. Who am I really? So the primary issue here is Christology. He begins again by calling himself the Son of Man, as he had done in chapter 2, verse 10. But then he says that I am the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, the Pharisees claimed that Jesus' disciples were guilty of breaking the Sabbath because they plucked heads of grain on the Sabbath. And Jesus, in effect, is saying, my disciples are innocent because I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And they can do anything that I authorize on the Sabbath or at any other time. And so, in other words, he is asserting his superiority over the Sabbath, and hence his authority to abrogate or transform Sabbath law. This is an astounding claim, because just as we saw in the beginning of chapter 2 that only God has the right to forgive someone's sin, only God has the authority over the Sabbath and the authority to abrogate or transform the Sabbath, because the Sabbath was God's law. And so this, as one writer points out, who Jesus is being progressively revealed as the Lord in his teaching, in his action, in relation to spiritual powers and physical illness, in his declaration of the forgiveness of sins, and now even in relation to that most sacred of divine institutions, the Sabbath itself. This, he says, the Christological stakes could hardly be higher than this. This is a messianic claim of grand proportions, and it also raises the possibility of future change or reinterpretation of the Sabbath. And by the way, our Ecclesia book on biblical theology has a section on how Jesus fulfilled and replaced the Sabbath. His claim to be Lord of the Sabbath relates not only to his own conduct, but affects the conduct of others. And so, again, only God could have done that. So, yes, Jesus was a man, but in all of these ways, forgiveness of other people's sins, now claiming to be the Lord of the Sabbath and permitting what was prohibited on the Sabbath, he is saying, I'm more than just a man. Now, the final of the 5 episodes that led to the opposition of Jesus, the first was the healing of the paralyzed man. The second was the calling of Levi, eating with him. The third was the discussion of your disciples don't fast. The fourth was the disciples eating grain on the Sabbath. The fifth event here is in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, which says this. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Now, this last of the 5 incidents culminates with the Pharisees and the Herodians counseling together how to destroy and kill Jesus. And now, in this event, it's not simply Jesus' disciples are doing something on the Sabbath, as in plucking the grain, but now it's Jesus himself. And further, the healing that Jesus performs on the Sabbath is not in a private house like it was in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. It is in the synagogue itself. And given the fact that he told the man with the withered hand to stand and come forward in the synagogue before all of these people, Jesus appears to have deliberately healed the man as a challenge to those who were watching him so that they might accuse him. Now, his question in verse 4, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill, reiterates the principle that he had stated in chapter 2, verse 27, when he said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The people, the Pharisees, knew the answer to that question, but they could not bring themselves to admit it. They knew that the proper answer is to do good, to save life. And in Matthew's account of this event, Jesus makes this clear by giving an example when he said, which of you has a sheep? If it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. You see, the silence of the Pharisees, even though they knew the correct answer to Jesus' question, amounts to doing harm. To abandon a helpless man would be to cause him to remain crippled, and it would clearly be to do harm. So the silence of the Pharisees in answer to Jesus' question is equivalent to the Levite and the priest who passed by on the other side in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. In other words, failure to do good when we can do good amounts to doing evil. And to not save a life when we can do so amounts to killing it. This is a profound spiritual point that applies to our own lives too. Now, we may not be in a position to save an actual life, but everyone is in a position to do good. And, you know, this can be in very hard circumstances. For example, in the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, I mean, 1 million people were killed in 3 months. There were a few Hutu who, at risk of their own lives, saved and sheltered Tutsis. During World War II, when the Nazis were targeting the Jews, there were a few Germans and others who sheltered the Jews. And so this principle is profound. We may never be in circumstances like that, and I hope that we're not. But that is the principle that Jesus is announcing here. You see how deep and profound these things are. You know, if you just read this on the surface, we don't think that way. But what Jesus is saying is, this is how we are to live if we are gospel people, if we are his disciples. And let me conclude by saying this. In verse 5, it says, Jesus was both angry and grieved at the same time. He was angry because the Pharisees had murder in their hearts. And as Luke's account of this event tells us, he knew their thoughts. He was grieved at their hardness of heart. You see, Jesus knew that humanity's real problem is not religion or tradition or ignorance or the law. The real problem is the human heart itself. And only Jesus can change our heart and give us a new heart, a heart of flesh, instead of our hearts of stone. So I end this lecture by pointing out this last event, these series of 5 events, but culminating in this one, marks a turning point in Jesus' ministry, because the Pharisees desired to keep their hearts hard rather than to follow Jesus, and therefore they went out immediately and held counsel with their former enemies, the Herodians, against Jesus, how to destroy him. So from this point on, all they are trying to do, and we will see again and again in different ways, they try to trap him, they try to accuse him, because now they have murder in their hearts. And it all came about, ironically, by Jesus doing good, by bringing life, by bringing forgiveness, by bringing inclusiveness, by healing people, by doing the things that the Pharisees should have been doing if they really loved God and human beings who are made in God's image.